Oogenesis is the process of meiosis that occurs within the ovary. So let's take a closer look at this chart as there is a lot going on. In females before birth, so during the embryonic and the fetal, all of the stem cells are referred to as oogonia. And oogonia are diploid cells, which means they contain 23 pairs of chromosomes, which is 46 total chromosomes. And that is represented as 2n, which equals 46. There's mitotic divisions of oogonia, which produce primary oocytes. And those primary oocytes are also diploid cells. So they have 46 chromosomes. Those primary oocytes start the process of meiosis, but are arrested in prophase 1. So all of this is going on before birth. There's an oogonium, and mitosis is just making an exact copy of itself, but meiosis is what we refer to as reduction division because it goes from 46 to 23 chromosomes. So the primary oocyte is going to be arrested in prophase 1, so it sort of pauses there. Prophase 1 is one of the first phases of meiosis 1. So this diagram is showing you the events not only of the cell developing in this column, but also the development of the follicles, which are the cells that sort of surround and nourish that oocyte. So for the follicles, we see a primordial follicle with the oocyte inside of it. The histology would look like this with a primary oocyte. And the primordial follicles are going to be located in the cortex of the ovary. During childhood, the ovary is inactive and it still houses those primordial follicles. And meiosis 1 stays arrested in prophase 1. Monthly from puberty to menopause now, we have these events. So about 20 primordial follicles are stimulated to mature into primary follicles every month. And some of those primary follicles mature into secondary follicles, but some of them do not undergo that maturation process. So when a follicle is selected, that primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle and eventually an antral follicle. Within those three phases are all primary oocytes, which are still arrested in prophase 1. So again, we still have a diploid amount of chromosomes, 46 total chromosomes. So histologically, this first one would be the primary follicle, and the difference is really the amount of cuboidal epithelium cells that surround it. This would be called the secondary follicle. And then finally, we have an antral follicle because there is the presence of the antrum. Then one antral follicle is what's going to develop into a mature follicle where the primary oocyte completes its first meiotic division and produces a secondary oocyte. At this point, it has 23 chromosomes. So now it's called haploid. So we have N equals 23. So we have a mature follicle, and that is what is shown on the histology, which is over here on the right side of your slide. We then have ovulation that occurs during the middle of the cycle, usually can vary in women, but the ovulated secondary oocyte is the haploid, one that's ovulated. If fertilization does occur, that means that the sperm pierces the outer membrane surrounding that secondary oocyte, and meiosis II is completed. In that case, the corpus luteum is going to support that developing embryo and then fetus. However, if fertilization does not occur or something happens to the pregnancy, that corpus luteum will degenerate into scar tissue, which is called the corpus albicans. But if the secondary oocyte is fertilized, it completes the secondary meiotic division, becomes an ovum, and if it is not fertilized, it's going to degenerate. So that is the process of what is called oogenesis, which is the type of meiosis that occurs in the ovary. On our next slide, we have the uterine tubes, again, also referred to as the fallopian tubes. They extend laterally from both sides of the uterus. The secondary oocyte is usually fertilized in the lateral part of the uterine tube, which means that it is close to the ovary. So it's in the distal third, usually, of the uterine tube. Usually takes the preembryo approximately 3 days to travel the length of the uterine tube and reach the lumen of the uterus. Regions of the uterus include the infundibulum, which contains the finger-like projections called the fimbria. And those fimbria are going to enclose the ovary at the time of ovulation to help the secondary oocyte be released into the uterine tube. The ampulla is the expanded region medial to the infundibulum where fertilization typically occurs. The isthmus is medial to the ampulla and represents about a third of the entire length of the uterine tube. And then the uterine tube is medial to that. The uterine tube has 3 different layers. The mucosa is ciliated columnar epithelial cells, and the muscularis is the middle layer with an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer, and then the serosa is the external layer. The uterus has 4 different regions. It has a fundus body, an isthmus, as well as the cervix. The cervix, within the cervix is a narrow cervical canal that connects to the vagina. The superior opening of the cervix is called the internal os, and the inferior opening is called the external os. Within the uterus, there are 3 important layers. The innermost layer is the part that is responsive to hormones and sloughs off every month. Specifically, it's the functional layer of the endometrium and is shred as menses if fertilization and implantation do not occur. The basal layer is the deeper layer that undergoes little change during the uterine cycle. The middle layer is the myometrium, which is smooth muscle stimulated by oxytocin. And then the outermost layer is the perimetrium. This slide is showing the various hormones and their influence on ovarian and uterine cycles. So GnRH is the hormone secreted from the hypothalamus, and that stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to produce both FSH as well as LH. FSH is released from the anterior pituitary gland, just like LH is. However, FSH is going to stimulate development and maturation of the ovarian follicles, while LH is going to stimulate ovulation when there is a peak in LH. Estrogens are released from the ovarian follicles, corpus luteum, or placenta, and they initiate and maintain growth of the functional layer of the endometrium. Whereas progesterone is secreted from the corpus luteum or the placenta, and it's the primary hormone responsible for the functional layer growth after ovulation and causes an increase in blood vessel distribution, uterine gland size, as well as nutrient production.